Nobody said it would be easy. Nobody said that it would all be fine. But to get where we're going, brother, you gotta hold the line. It ain't a matter of if, no, it's just a matter of time. But to get where we're going.
Hello lovelies, today we're taking a look at the Cobra Codex sourcebook for the G.I. Joe role-playing game. I'm not a huge fan of Essence 20, but having made up a lot of characters for it and played it for Transformers, it's winning me over a little bit, at least in terms of one-shots or short campaigns. It might be a lot of fun. But the drawbacks in the system, the problems in the system, definitely come to the fore at higher levels. I would be wary of just how broken it's going to get to anything higher than about 6th level. Particularly if you're playing members of Cobra and fighting G.I. Joe or Action Force, as it was here in the UK. Because Snake Eyes is essentially impossible to hit. So, there are clearly problems at higher levels, as there are with so many RPGs. The higher level game just isn't balanced. But yeah, this is the Cobra source book. And the book, much like Cobra itself, is better than G.I. Joe in every way. And in terms of the book as well. A lot of the shortcomings in the core book have been overcome here. It's a lot easier to navigate. The origins are much better laid out. So all in all, it's just better, I think. It shows progress, not so much in terms of design, but in terms of game design, but in terms of book design, layout, accessibility, and so on. And Cobra is just cooler, so that makes the artwork inherently better. It does a pretty good job of making Cobra sound a little bit more sympathetic. You may regard that as a good or a bad thing. These are outcasts. These are people who came in second in a lot of ways. These are people who have been passed over by society as it exists now, and so have set out to usurp and take it over. Or at least those are the people being taken advantage of by the greater Cobra organization. You get a decent sort of background on everything, and it does do a pretty good job of trying to integrate the toys, the cartoon, the film, and some of the comic book stuff as well. You know, it even talks about Cobra La, which is a controversial choice, possibly more controversial than allowing you to play terrorists, which seems like a very edgy and risky thing for a game to do these days, especially for a game that is, after all, targeted at least somewhat at kids, you would think, as with the Transformers RPG. Tweens and teens, maybe, but maybe they're aiming more at the old heads, the people who matured and progressed into the comics. I don't know. But I thought that was daring, even if it does still mention safety tools and all that bollocks elsewhere, which kind of takes the edge off a bit. So you get some new influences, many of which are transposable to playing G.I. Joe characters as well, particularly Renegades. You get Angry, it's a sort of rage-fueled chemist, a chemical background obviously. Conniving, which is the sort of Cobra style of leadership and internecine warfare. Someone who's desperate and has turned to Cobra because they're desperate. Maybe they owe money to the mob or something, and Cobra provides them protection. Disenfranchised, people who are dicked over or left out. indoctrinated, people who've been basically brainwashed into joining Cobra. Thanks, Dr. Mindbender. Mistrustful scapegoats. So Storm Shadow, he's an anti-hero, isn't he? Not exactly a villain, so he's a good example of a scapegoat, someone who has had blame heaped upon them and has nowhere else to go. Spoiled brats, someone with a tragic background that's twisted them up and sent them to Cobra. People who are unscrupulous, just don't care who they work for as long as they get to forward their science or wealth or whatever. People who are outright villainous, and people who just like violence. But there's quite a lot of these that could be transposed to, or provide the basis for a modified influence for a G.I. Joe character. Origins-wise, so the origins in the main G.I. Joe book, they're all cramped together, and it's basically what branch of the military you come from, and all kinds of exception cases and so on, and it's appallingly badly laid out and very, very confusing. In the Cobra book, they have given each origin its own segment, more like the influences, and it's all laid out nicely. You know exactly what you get without cross-referencing. It makes things more explicit and even gives examples of Joe characters who might have that kind of origin if you wanted to use it instead. So yeah, there's plenty of good stuff there. So that's origins. You don't get new roles, but you do get new role options, which again, like these origins, slightly less well laid out, but these are extra additional options, mostly specializations that you can find for the various character classes, roles from the main book. So you get new options for commandos, such as Poisoner, for example, a Saboteur, new options for infantry, such as Armiger, which is a good option for weapon specialists in Joes as well. Variants of people who've been cybernetically or genetically modified. Again, that might be something you could transpose to a Joe character. You can imagine someone who got blown up by an IED or something and then cybernetically enhanced and comes back. Exemplar officer option, Taskmaster officer option. Obviously the Baroness is a good example of an officer, or Major Blood perhaps. Ranger options is the one I think that is the most different and the most interesting, because you've got Guerrilla Fighter, which is obviously easily transposable, and Firestarter, which is sort of Pyromaniac, I suppose. Sorry, I meant to say Renegade is probably the most... No, not Renegade. No. Oh no, it is Renegade. Okay, so Renegade's probably the most interesting new options, because you've got Rigger, which is like an ace pilot or a vehicle driver, which is something that was definitely missing from the original main book. So it's good to have that as an option. Someone who's like at one with their vehicle. So that's a nice option. The technician ones, you get like a jetpack trooper option and a biotechnician. So that's okay. Vanguard, you get City Striker, so urban warfare specialist, which is a good one to have, and Warthog for melee combatants, basically. So if you want to play the Refrigerator as a Joe character, you might want to take Warthog as a background. Goes into the various organizations and so on within Cobra to a slight degree. There is a sort of affiliations book coming out at some point, so you'll be able to play Sergeant Slaughter's Slammers at some point, or other specialist subgroups within Cobra or Joe. At least I hope they continue to support Cobra the same amount. We've got lots of stuff on genetic alterations and cybernetics. Obviously, Cobra has their own equipment. This is an area in which Essence 20 falls down a bit, I think. Yeah, you've got options for weapons and so on, but in terms of granularity, there isn't much there, which in a military game, certainly less so in Transformers, you might want a bit more granularity, not less. And quite often you're just sort of buying traits and things for weapons that don't necessarily do a great deal. But yeah, more options is good, and obviously you get options for your pets, drones, and weapons that can be transposed between the two versions of the game as well. Obviously, we want the Cobra vehicles. I'm not as aware of what was available in terms of American toys or things that appeared in the comics, but most of the stuff that I was aware of from the toy line over here seems to be there. Money plays more of a role for Cobra than it does for G.I. Joe, so they have a sort of abstracted wealth system. So if you wanted to be a bit more money oriented or play a third party that's neither Cobra nor Joe's, then you might want that. You get some GM advice. It's kind of generic, a little bit wishy-washy on playing baddies, but you know, Cobra from the comics and cartoons isn't exactly subtle, so you know, scenery chewing is is perfectly acceptable. Threat system doesn't particularly work, but you'll rapidly figure out, you know, your best sort of judgment. I would say use the health levels of the characters that you're pitting yourselves against, as the GM, to kind of gauge what you're up against. We get a few profiles of Joe's, which is nice, but nowhere near enough. Obviously, we want to see all of them eventually, and all the Cobra characters. So, yeah, there's the problem about hitting Snake Eyes. It's essentially impossible. But it does give you a few more baddies that you can use as well in your standard Joe campaign, in that it details more Cobra soldiers and so on. Including zombies, which I don't remember. So, I don't know. Must have been an American thing. I think that's about it. You know, rules for contacts and sort of tapping into criminal organisations and so on. Yeah, so having contacts with leaders within Cobra will give you certain advantages, perks, access to, or easier access to other equipment and so on. So that kind of encourages that internal strife and jockeying for position that we all know from the cartoon and the comics. We get a little adventure, kind of meh, because adventures always are. Should have used the extra space for more character profiles, in my not so humble opinion. Alright, so yeah, it's a supplementary book, obviously, so it doesn't contain everything you need, but in just about every way, I think it's an improvement on the original G.I. Joe core book, and I hope this is the direction that they continue in with the supplementary material for both Transformers and G.I. Joe. I'm a little bit more converted to Essence 20, at least for one-shots and short campaigns at a low to mid-level. So, yeah, in all regards, this is better. In terms of style, I'm going to give it a 4. Dropped from a 5 because some of the artwork falls into the same sort of muddiness that we see in Wizards of the Coast artwork, where it lacks definition, where it lacks vibrance, where it lacks contrast. There's an example of the better art, and there's an example of the not so good art. I mean, it's even more stark on the screen. You can make out the details here, you can make out the edges, The colour's been used effectively, whereas here this kind of turns into a brownish grey blob on the screen, which just goes to show the problem with the artwork. I don't know why this afflicts so many games, whether it's a stylistic choice that people are making, whether it's an issue with the print process, I don't know, but I wish everyone would up the contrast and up the vibrance. Or maybe my eyes are slowly degenerating. Who knows? So 4 out of 5 for style. In terms of substance, I mean, again, it's lacking that one thing that we all really want, which is stats for all the characters. And it fills in a lot of gaps from the G.I. Joe core book with its backgrounds and so on, and gives you more room to play around, more things to adapt or tweak slightly in the ways that you want. But yeah, it's lacking the things that we all really want. So in that case, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5 for substance. So overall, it's an 8 out of 10 or a 4 out of 5. So if you like Essence 20 enough, if you like G.I. Joe enough, and if you already have the G.I. Joe core book, this kind of completes the core book and makes Cobra campaigns much more viable. And yeah, Cobra's just better. Zang.
Fatal Highway is a set of post-apocalyptic road war rules for Fate. This is a quick set of tried and tested rules for vehicles, vehicle chases, vehicle weapons, and operating at scale. This version also contains some ideas written up for a Fate version of 45 Psychobilly Retropocalypse. This booklet is all about cars, chases, crashes, and some post-apocalyptic inspiration for those who want to play Road Warriors. You can purchase it at post-mort.com, lulu.com, and drive-through RPG.